and his compatriots made a lot of arguments, which revolved around Brexit essentially as a matter of national identity in several ways, appealing to cultural, historical, and sovereignty-based narrative here, according to the wiki. So let's go through some of these and perhaps try to address the issue to a more satisfying degree. Okay, so I believe that a lot of the sentiments he originally engendered around the subject are completely valid. For example, British exceptionalism and cultural distinctiveness, I think, are two very big aspects of English culture that I could say definitively make British culture fundamentally different from that of continental Europe. And so a lot of the problem here goes back to really to Burke's arguments with the nascent French revolutionaries and really the French Enlightenment. So to go back to the beginning and start where there would be no ambiguity about the beginnings of English history, I would note that early English history itself revolves around various conquests of England by distinct groups and tribes. That is, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes, which contributed to the Anglo language and its evolution. Of course, the Norman conquest contributing to French influence in the language. They also end up establishing the early medieval kingdoms. So I guess I would note also that these people were allowed in the British Isles, I believe, by Providence, because they influenced culture before they came. The Britons were in a state of essentially being taken over back and forth by various tribes, and the conquest, where they would seem to deprive the English people of a distinct cultural heritage, actually provided most English people with a cultural heritage, whether it be Rome or the Normans or the Anglo-Saxons, indeed. Through every conquest, through every permutation of this phenomenon, the English people actually developed a more distinct identity. It kept being formed by the conquests themselves. So the fact that none of these conquests were perpetuated by a single ethnicity reflects later English history in that by the 1700s, you have the famous author Daniel Defoe essentially making fun of the concept of race as it is arising from the French Enlightenment in the late 1600s, 1680s. So in 1701, of course, Daniel Defoe writes a famous poem where he makes fun of the idea that the English would be proud of a distinct genealogy. And I think the final passage is really what's most revealing, so I want to read it for you right now. Okay, the final passage, or the final paragraph says, "Some think of England, 'twas our Saviour meant, the gospel should to all the world be sent, since, when the blessed sound did hit the reach, they to all nations might be set to preach." And that was from 1701, so the idea, of course, being that by that time, so many ethnos, essentially so many peoples, had conquered and settled and been shifted around the British Isles, such that, particularly Britain, such that there would be, by Providence, so many people there that when it came time for them to preach the gospel, which was like an old English sort of cultural legend, that England would be instrumental in preaching the gospel to the whole world, which I believe is true personally, that there would be so many different ethnos there that they could be well equipped to reciprocate and preach the gospel to all the peoples of the world. So he very cheekily says that Jesus said when the gospel should be sent to all the world, he really just meant the British Isles, because all the world would already be there. So it's kind of funny, and the point is that even around the time that the modern notion of race is arising, you see a distinct English repudiation of it, not even necessarily belligerent. They really essentially just make fun of the concept. It's completely foreign, completely continental, has nothing to do with the way that England developed as a historical particularity of the island. So you get a lot of cultural contributions from the Anglo-Saxons, for example, obviously the English language, England, and Beowulf is probably the foremost epic poem. Burke's first problem was that of the new Whigs versus the old Whig, where he essentially posited that a lot of the new political figures in the Whig party were really belonged to the faction of those what they would call philosophes, essentially the French Enlightenment thinkers, and people like Thomas Paine, for example, and his compatriots, people who sympathized with him, really were throwing back to that philosophical movement from continental Europe. So the problem, of course, is that after the Enlightenment in continental Europe, the French Enlightenment, you get Burke's fight against that phenomenon. He doesn't believe that the phenomenon is English in any way, shape, or form. He believes, in fact, that it'll come to prey on England when the revolution takes over. And he was obviously right, obviously. So at this time, he has an argument with some of the Whigs in his party, and he writes a tract called The New Whigs versus the Old, or something to that effect, where he posits that a lot of the new Whigs in his party are essentially of a different belief system, maybe even a different sort of religious conviction than himself, and who he claims are the, I guess, old Whigs, the classical Whigs. Burke's perennial struggle throughout a lot of his writings is to reinforce the Glorious Revolution, which to some nowadays in modernity, I suppose, would seem a bit counterintuitive, right? So John Locke almost died essentially because he wanted to perpetuate the Glorious Revolution. He was instrumental, in fact, in doing so. So it seems, again, counterintuitive that the arch liberal John Locke would somehow come down on the same side as Edmund Burke, who is considered the arch conservative. Now, I guess in order to elucidate this point, we should note that just as a matter of historical particularity, the terms liberal and conservative do come as a result of the French Revolution. So it should be noted that my thesis here is essentially a historically valid, of course. These terms arise in the 1820s as a dialogue between France and Britain, of course. And they arise as a meta-narrative, essentially, a meta-narrative version of the history of England, which of course that phenomenon would be known as Whig history. And so the idea is, after Burke dies, before the revolution ends, the Whig historians that he hated so much take over English history, and in legitimizing the French Revolution, they enshrine the abstract notion, the abstract view of the world that Burke hated so much. And that abstract view, of course, is that it's really all just a matter of ideology fighting, and it's all really about power, which is the core of the French Enlightenment thought. I guess retrospectively what happens then is history is now viewed through the liberal and conservative meta-narrative, where neither Burke nor Locke would have seen it that way. And again, the evidence for that is that Burke went through such great lengths to reaffirm the Glorious Revolution that Locke perpetuated. Now what you get is, frankly, a lot of people who don't know much saying that Locke was, of course, very liberal and he would have had nothing to do with Burke, yet everything Burke did was conducive to justifying Locke. So I don't believe that. Now, in conclusion, I guess I would say that the debate of the New Whigs versus the Old Whigs essentially morphed into the New Whig idea of liberal versus conservative. And because of that narrative, now we can actually see past into English history and see that England was its own sort of insulated island away from the continental Enlightenment that was going on at the time. Which is why when it came to England, or even when it was posed that the French Enlightenment might come to England, that was met with universal repudiation and disgust, really. Of course, England and France were perennial enemies at that time. I guess in conclusion, or lastly rather, I want to bring up a lot of what people are saying about the argument of English identity, particularly with the Lotus Eaters, which is a podcast of, I guess I would call them leftists. I don't know what they would call themselves, but I believe postmodernism is just a denomination of leftism. So in the recent weeks, they've been sort of coming up with a lot of videos talking about the English identity crisis, where essentially all they do is talk about ethnicity. And what I find so striking about the videos is that they bring up the identity crisis a lot in spirit, right? But they only ever, aside from never really diagnosing the problem, they only ever make the argument crystallize around the notion of ethnicity. And so they've made a lot of videos essentially talking about whether people who have ethnic backgrounds in, I don't know, India, Pakistan, and you know all the problem that's going on there with the rape ban. So I won't say that I don't understand what they're talking about. I do understand what they're talking about. And it is precisely because of that I understand that their arguments about ethnicity are completely illegitimate. And I think that this is what I said in the beginning, that I know a lot of the Englishmen in that island are being tricked essentially by this line of reasoning, in that, as I mentioned earlier, most of the people who first encountered that notion of race, that modern notion of race coming from France, capital M modern, not only they were not upset about it, they either didn't say anything about it or they actively made fun of it because they thought it was such a foreign concept. And this would have been around the late 1600s, early 1700s. So I read that poem from Daniel Defoe, who talks about essentially ethnic multiplicity being just an aspect of English history going back to literally the beginning, like literally before Rome, right? And I would think that such a precedented aspect of English history would be essentially non-negotiable at this point. That it would not really be an issue, but these people keep bringing it up, right? The Lotus Eaters, every video that they make, they say that the argument is fundamentally ethnic in nature, without explicitly saying whether they believe the Britain is an ethno-nationalist enterprise. And I wish they would, frankly. I wish they would just say that they believe that, because right now what they're doing is they're causing, if not a lot of confusion, then actively essentially lying to people. Why? Well, as I said, no one in the past ever brought up ethnicity as a particularity of English history. In fact, as we've discussed already, ethnic multiplicity is virtually the only precedented aspect of English history, really, going back to before even Christianity was there. Naturally, it being an island, it would have been getting conquered a lot. And frankly, I believe the Christian religion put an end to that. It consolidated all of these ethnos under one distinct theological heritage, if you will, eventually, right? Because of the English Reformation and such. And of course, naturally from there you get the Glorious Revolution to re-enshrine Protestantism forever. So yeah, I guess in closing, I would just warn against the arguments that somehow ethnicity is precedented on the English soil. It's really not. I guess in conclusion, or lastly rather, I want to bring, I guess one thing that I'll talk about in closing, of course, is the English common law. And we here in the United States receive a lot of, frankly, most of our legal discipline is also based on the English common law. And right now there is an issue surrounding citizenship, which would have to take the English common law into consideration, I would say. So I believe it was one of the early rulings where the court in England essentially came to the conclusion that whoever was in the jurisdiction of England would be subject to its ruler, its king, right? And in consolidating power around the king, they did away with the whole notion of whether a god could truly have a birthright to be English. And this is how birthright citizenship, or in that case, subjectship, was gained. It cleared up a lot of errors when it comes to who belongs and what makes a person belong. And I guess I'm praying and closing that this would happen again somehow, that people would realize that. And I guess maybe it's a metaphor, but really our ancestors had such a esteem for the crown that I could only really pray that the crown would somehow bring together the people of England to realize that within their jurisdiction is a legitimate, a sovereign, and a divine mandate to be united. And it's certainly not helpful to that spread lies about how people are united to begin with, anthropologically. Rather, the whoever has jurisdiction therein has full jurisdiction therein, and I don't believe lies should be spread to the opposite effect, that somehow there is some sort of a mystical jurisdiction whereby you're subject to the laws, but you're not really subject because of your race or ethnicity. I know that degrades other people, foreign people, but it certainly degrades Englishmen much more, and I wish that they would realize that. In closing, I would just say thank you for watching, and if you have any points to the contrary, I would like to hear them in the comment section. And if you have any feedback, if you want me to cover any other topics, or you want me to clear up anything, I know this is my first video, I wasn't very on key, but if you want me to relitigate the matter, then I will. Alright, thank you. I will see you tomorrow or some other day. I'll see you guys later.